All right, welcome everyone to our talk. I imagine a few people will stroll in with their lunches as we get started, but I want to make sure we have time for questions and a full discussion here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and introduce our guest today. I'm excited to introduce a former colleague of mine, back from my days at IBM. So John Prager. He has been doing all kinds of interesting stuff related to natural language processing, text analysis, Q&A systems for a while. And one of his big claims to fame that you have probably heard of, whether you follow the literature or not, is captured here. So John was one of the core team members in the very first small group of people working on IBM Watson that ended up beating Ken Jennings and
Fred Brecker.
Yeah, the two grand champions in Jeopardy. And since then, IBM Watson has taken over lots of different areas where they've been trying to apply it, including electronic health record analysis, which is part of what John is going to talk about today. So I'm excited to introduce him for his talk here on from question answering to question anticipation, the trajectory of Watson in electronic medical record analysis.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you both for the introduction and for helping to set up this visit. So I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for attending this talk. I'm going to dispense with this picture because it's not about Jeopardy. I gave that impression from the title. What I'm going to be talking about is what our lab has been doing in the years since the Jeopardy event, which was coming up 7 years ago. So we've done a lot of things, but most of them have been in the medical clinical decision support area. So the title says trajectory. It's going to be a two-dimensional trajectory in the sense that it's going to go breadth-wise. I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 different activities that we've done, and then depth-wise, I'm going to dig in to some of the NLP requirements, natural language processing requirements and enhancements that we've been involved in, because the medical domain has some, it's kind of challenging, basically. So we've been looking in recent years at clinical notes, which are parts of the electronic medical record, and these are not well-edited documents. I don't know if any of you have seen any or just familiar with them. Doctors who are very smart are in a hurry when they're writing them. They are not very easy to read, especially for computers to read, to make sense of. So it's really a challenge. And just because we had a successful question answering effort in Jeopardy, which involved natural language understanding, there are many more challenges in the medical domain. We'll be talking about them. So I'll just begin with a quick discussion of what our lab looks like and what the general methodology is that we used in the lab. The first application area is an experimental method that we looked at, which was to try to answer questions, USMLE question sets, United States medical licensing exam questions. These are questions that medical students have to answer as part of their training and education. So it seems to be a good bridge from question answering to domain, which is why we took it upon ourselves. But I'm going to look at some of the different areas of NLP where we need to put some effort in order. This was, I suppose we could have anticipated it, but by working on Watson parts, which is the first scenario I'm going to talk about, it made us realize where all the deficiencies were in our current toolbox of language processing components, where we needed to put some effort. So I'll look at some of the efforts, some of the resources that we built, components that we built. Then it turned out, having that enhanced toolbox, we could then address other areas in the medical or clinical decision support area. So I'm going to talk about the EMRA project, Electronic Medical Record Analysis project. Probably all of you, whether you've seen them or not, have electronic medical records. If you've ever been to see a doctor, you have one. The challenge that we're taking on is not to replace the doctor by any means, but to let them do their job more readily, more efficiently, more productively by doing some of the heavy lifting, looking through masses of data. If you are, maybe not some of the youthful members in the audience here, if you've got gray hair like me, you probably have a medical record that's this big, suddenly printed out. And the doctor's expertise is in doing medicine. They're trained to do diagnosis, to recommend treatments, and so on. They could read like we can, but why should they have to read hundreds, or could be hundreds of pages of information just to know what to do? So I'm going to describe a couple of activities in our group. One is Semantic Find, which is an enhanced search capability against the medical record, and show you a dashboard that we built that will show an encapsulation of the patient's state of their treatment. So, just a few words about our current lab. The Jeopardy effort took place when we were in IBM Research. Shortly after that, IBM formed a new division called the Watson Division, which we were transplanted to, became the core research component of. Then a little while after that, the Watson Division bifurcated, because there was some activity in the health area and some not in health. It bifurcated, so Watson Health was then created, including our group, to handle all of the health and medical related activities. And then we were moved back into research because basically nobody knows how to deal with a bunch of researchers. They're basically marketing people. They don't know. So we ended up where we started. In our lab, there are two research teams. I'm in one of them, plus there's a development team. Obviously, IBM has an interest in making the work that we do available for products or services or for customers, and so it needs hardening application of certain software methodologies. And an IT team, about equal numbers in each team, maybe 8 or so. Also in the research team, it's about equal number of PhDs and master's level. We have had research engagements with Cleveland Clinic, Veterans Administration, and now a Boston area provider. This turns out to be very useful. We constantly need annotation. We need ground truth for a lot of the activities that we do, whether it's machine learning, for which we need training, or whether it's any component that needs evaluation, we need ground truth. So we've been lucky enough to have fourth-year medical students from our local medical school come and spend some time with us. They spend about 20 hours a week when it's a convenient part of the school year, and they do these annotation exercises, as well as answering medical questions. Because as researchers, we don't have the medical knowledge. So pick up a little bit by osmosis. We also have one, sometimes two, MDs on staff. Our computational framework is UEMA. I think I heard that some of you use GATE. It's a similar kind of framework for doing language processing. And we evaluate everything. All of the components that we build, all of the resources that we build, we constantly evaluate. Obviously, it's useful and even necessary for publication, but more to the point, we need to know if we have a component that is doing its job, and you can only tell by doing evaluation. This talk is not primarily going to be about evaluation, but there will be a couple of times I'm going to mention some evaluation numbers. So what's Watson Paths? This is a project that I think is more interesting than it was successful, but maybe you could be the judge of that. So the point is to answer these medical licensing exam questions. But I'll show you a couple of these examples. Unlike Jeopardy or any other trivia questions, there's not a one-line statement of a question. There's a paragraph. And the paragraph, it builds up a scenario about a patient and then just asks, well, a simple sounding question. So we use a graph-based approach, and I'm going to show you a graph-based representation of the solution process. I think you'll find it interesting. And we had a publication in AI magazine. So here is a sample question. It starts off very ordinarily. A mother brings her 5-year-old son into the medical office and then goes on to describe some rather disgusting symptoms and some other lab results and so on. And then ends with the question, what organism is the most likely cause of the disease in this patient? Now, no medical knowledge is required among you to understand what I'm about to tell you. So please don't get scared by that, even though it's a very scary kind.
How's that staff audience? Or stroke?
Unlike Jeopardy, the USMLE questions come with answers. You have to choose the right one. There's typically 5, but it could be as many as 8. So we need to build a system that gets from the scenario and the question to the right answer. Quite different from how we solve Jeopardy questions. Here's another example. Again, you don't have to read it, just sort of scan through it. You'll see it's the same general setup. It's describing the high points. There may be some misleading information that's not necessary to the solution. There's no guarantee that everything in there is required. And again, some answers. So it's not necessarily an easy thing. You can't necessarily get an answer by Googling with that whole question and each of the answers. Because the thing about medical questions is the patient is not in the textbook. The patient is not out there on the web. So unlike questions about Shakespeare or Australia or something where the facts that you're looking for are out there, it's just a matter of connecting with them, you can't do that with these medical questions. So there's a little bit of a bug in my presentation. I think it's a bug in PowerPoint, but it might be a bug in my ability to program PowerPoint. So I'm just going to, for purposes of this, go out of presentation mode, just to show you how it goes. Otherwise, I can't step through it. So what you see on the left is the question again. On the right, at the top, are a couple of questions from the scenario with some extracted, what we call clinical factors. So these are things that we think may be key to getting the answer. And the answers are along the bottom. So the challenge is to make the strongest connection between the factors that have been extracted and one, you hope, of the answers. The one that happens to be correct is the one in darker green. So if you just excuse the rearrangement, that's the layout program has a mind of its own. What we ended up with, after turning the handle a couple of times, is a strong connection with this one answer. How do we get the connection? We use Watson. We use Watson in an interesting way. When you have a clinical factor, you ask the question, well, what disease typically is associated with this clinical factor? And you get a bunch of answers with different strengths, and that gives you a certain amount of belief in your 5 answers. You start with the answers and say, well, these are diseases, but what are the factors or symptoms that are most strongly associated with it? So you go from the top down and the bottom up, and you build a kind of a network like this. And there are strengths on the network that correspond to the belief or the confidence that the question answering process is generated. And we can dig in, if you're in the user interface, to find some provenance and find some textual passages and so on. But the activity that the system takes is governed by a semantic network. We call it the emerald because it looks kind of like an emerald in terms of the sharp, octagonal, octahedral design. And it tells you which of the clinical semantic types are connected to which others by what kind of relation. So this tells you the question that you would want to ask. If you've got a disease and you have a finding, which is a medical term for symptom or sign, there's a causality relation. It tells you what the relations are that connect these semantic types. So that's the question that you're going to ask in order to try and get the strength of the connection. Then, okay, the second example has a different feature to it. Starts off the same way, extract sentences from the scenario, get factors from the scenario, from the scenario, and you ask questions of Watson that you might not generate a term that's one of your answer terms. So this is the interesting feature about this, where this process can uncover what we call missing links. Missing links happen to be an important part of the Final Jeopardy exercise. For those of you familiar with the show, Final Jeopardy questions at the end of the competition is one question, typically it's 30 seconds that contestants are given to answer, but it's not a trivia question where there's a simple question and answer that if you know it, you've got it right away. You typically have to do some figuring out. And a lot of the time that figuring out, you've got to think of some intermediate term or concept that connects the question and the answer. And that's exactly what's going on here, where when you ask these questions, that's why you have to really start from the bottom and move up, as well as start at the top and move down. You ask questions and you get these. So that's the final graph. By asking the questions, you're able to make a connection between the correct answer and the scenario. But I've been a little bit deceptive. I haven't shown all of the links. I've just shown a handful of links, the strongest links. As you can imagine, when you ask a question, sort of an open-ended question, like what disease are these symptoms significant for, you'll get lots of answers. Lots of them will have very low weight or confidence, but you get lots. And the more you iterate that, the more it expands out. So this is 1/3 of the diagram that got generated for one of those questions or similar kind of questions. So you have a massive graph that has to be processed. So the final word I want to give on this is that some subset of USMLE questions are like the ones that I just presented, where you have to do some kind of a diagnosis. Or a diagnosis is necessary because it's asking about a treatment, but you really got to do the diagnosis and then figure out what the treatment is, or what's the organism that's involved, or what part of the body is affected. On that subset, we were told by medical people that no, we got a passing grade. So the score when we evaluated on a few hundred of these such questions was at the level of a passing grade for this subset of questions. There are a whole bunch of questions on the exam that are definitional, or they talk about bedside manner, all kinds of things that are not like this. So it doesn't mean that we could pass the medical boards, but it does mean for the diagnosis questions we did quite well. Okay, so I'm going to leave that and talk about some of the medical text processing needs. So I talked about clinical factors. These are the things that got derived from the sentence in that scenario. Most of NLP is about matching. You've got some text here and some text there. Do they match? Do they mean the same thing? All the different fields of NLP, in my opinion, boil down to that question. So here's an example: abdominal pain, aching chest. They're not exactly the same, but they're very close to each other. You'd want to give a good match. How would you get a system to do that? Okay, if you don't have a dictionary that says they correspond to the same concept. If you look at it, the adjectives don't match up with each other. The adjectives are abdominal and aching. They're not the same. The nouns are pain and chest. They're not the same. So you need some more informed way of doing the matching than just trying simple part of speech matching. Doing an every word to every word would work in this case, but not if you've got long sentences. Then it would just explode. So I'm going to talk a little bit about factor composition grammar, which is a way of understanding the semantics of sentences. Negation is very important because unlike in the open domain context, questions about, I mentioned Shakespeare in Australia and Germany and Abraham Lincoln, which is what Jeopardy is all about. The questions are all in the affirmative. The statements in your dictionaries, encyclopedia, news stories, they're all in the affirmative. You don't need to handle negatives. But in the medical field, it's very much about what the patient has and what the patient doesn't have. So you don't want to be distracted, or you want to separately capture the negated statements. They may be important, but you want to set them aside from the affirmative. UMLS. Now, I don't know how familiar people are with UMLS. There's some nodded heads there. Is there anybody who doesn't know what UMLS is? Okay, Unified. No, I forget what it is. It's a huge ontology of medical terms handled by the National Institute of Health, National Library of Medicine. Are you familiar with WordNet? Some of you may be familiar with WordNet. WordNet is on a much smaller scale. It's basically just regular English, although there are some concentrations in some domains to WordNet. WordNet was produced by lexicographers in Princeton. It does a great job. It's great. We use it for the regular English words that are part of the medical vocabulary, but the medical terms, at least the not the lay medical terms, the professional medical terms are not present. So we need to use UMLS. So there are about 3 million concepts. It's very, very useful. It's organized in hierarchies of terms under semantic types. There are relations between the terms. It's a very good starting point, but it is deficient. It's deficient along a bunch of dimensions that we have to augment or put band-aids on in order to make it useful. I listed some of them here. So this is again the same graph layout program was responsible for this. Here's the idea. You have at the top right there a statement that might be in your medical record or it might be in an exam. She had pain in the epigastric region and sometimes on the right side of her abdomen. Okay, there are a lot of words there. You're familiar with diagramming sentences from school, no doubt, but it's not useful just to separate out the verbs and the nouns and the adjectives. So even in a dependency diagram, which is what computer scientists tend to do nowadays, this is a semantic, the results of using a semantic grammar, which show how the sentence is put together in a semantically meaningful way. So, all right, I'll just point. So at the top there, we've got one of the conditions, pain in the right side of the abdomen sometimes. We've got the second condition here, pain in the epigastric region. It breaks down the condition to be a smaller statement of the condition and a temporal modifier, which is sometimes. But that condition is now broken down to a core condition, which is pain, and an anatomical modifier, which is right side of the abdomen. And the right side of the abdomen likewise recursively breaks down into abdomen and right side. Okay, so why is that useful? Okay, there are rules such as what I gave here, where unlike the noun plus preposition type grammar rules that you might be familiar with, you've got an anatomy and a spatial modifier gives you a broader anatomical. So here's a statement you might want to match with it. Right? The statement is lower body ache daily. So again, you apply the factor composition grammar to break down that statement into its constituent parts. And now you know what the conditions are, you know the anatomical parts, and you want to be able to match like with like. So you would match ache with pain. When I say match, you would establish a correspondence with lower body with abdomen, and then daily with sometimes. These aren't synonyms. You wouldn't get this by doing a synonym lookup, but you now know the terms that you need to match up with each other, and downstream components can give a confidence or a weight or some kind of a score to how well these do, and hence how well the whole matching takes place. All right. Said that. So this is a view of a clinical note. I don't know, have any of you seen clinical notes that doctors take? Some small number of you have. don't have to read that. I'm going to highlight some of the ingredients that you see in this, or notes in general. This is the kind of language that needs to be dealt with by a language processing system that goes sort of above and beyond the language that you find in regular encyclopedia articles, news articles, and so on. So there are all kinds of problems that need to be overcome in order to be able to do meaningful text processing. So let's just take a little bit of a look at negation. There is a standard component in the industry called negex that is useful, but it's a little bit, what it does is it looks for words like not, or no, or never, and then basically says anything to the left, to the right of it is negated. But you know that no pain in the leg is only going to negate the pain, it's not going to negate the leg. So if you have a pause-based analysis and you understand grammar, then you can do a better job at identifying the trigger word and the scope of the negation. In addition, UMLS, I said it was deficient in certain ways. It doesn't have contradicted or negated relations. It doesn't tell you which terms are mutually incompatible with each other or mean the opposite. So we can do that in a couple of ways. There are prefixes. These all happen to be Greek. A lot of the rest of the talk is going to be in Greek, that have opposite meanings to each other. Right? Hyper and hypo basically mean above and below. So the term with hypertension, hypotension, they're opposite to each other. One means you've got a higher than normal blood pressure, the other means you've got lower than normal. So they're mutually incompatible. You can't have them both at the same time. Also, in the medical dictionary, terms that mean the same thing but opposite to each other will usually have a similar definition except for the word not in there, or on a negating term. So by mining this and so on, you can build negated relations. Hypotheticals, a little bit like negated, the meaning's different, but the usefulness is the same. If there's a discussion in the medical record that's saying the doctor talked to you about doing this in order to attest, to rule out some problem, or in order to prevent some problem, or you're at risk of that problem. In all those cases, that problem you don't have. It's being discussed. You don't have it. So any process, some application that's looking into the medical record to try and find out something about your medical care situation doesn't want to associate you yet, at least, with that condition, because you don't have it. And again, there's some more language that can be done in order to take terms that aren't in UMLS. Non-palpable spleen, not in UMLS, but palpable spleen is, whatever it means. We know that with the non-prefix, and there are others, it means the opposite. So just a little bit about components that we have that do some language analysis. Some fancy sounding, complicated medical terms on the left. By doing the morphological analysis, by breaking it down into the root word and the prefixes and the suffixes, you can figure out what it means. Hyperkalemia means you've got too much potassium, the potassium levels are too high, and so on with the others. So, not rocket science, but if it hasn't been done, then it's a useful thing to do to augment your components. I mentioned WordNet, very, very good. It's more complete in certain aspects than UMLS is, but there are some deficiencies. And of course, your example that you're dealing with has to run into that deficiency. So here's one. WordNet has relations between different parts of speech that come from the same root word. So extended is related to extension. Suspended is related to suspension. And there are others. By using a kind of reasoning by analogy, we can propose that distended is related to distension, even though there's no such link with that, just by knowing that we tend to form words in much the same way. So I mentioned that UMLS has some problems. The concepts, the CUI is sometimes used as a synonym for the concept. It's the code. It's the letter C with 7 digits. You'll see a couple of these subsequently. Corresponds to the concept. Each term might have some variance. If you've got high blood pressure or hypertension, Sometimes they're variants of the same thing. And there are relations between them. There are well-known systems that people use. MetaMap is one, CTAKES is another, and I'm sure that there are others. In order to annotate, I'm using that in the system sense, not the human sense, to run an annotator on your text and determine where the locations are of these concepts. And that's what these systems do. But UMLS doesn't have all reasonable paraphrases because it was not designed in order to, by someone who's generating all possible paraphrases. So you might have high blood pressure but not increased blood pressure, for example. You can't represent numeric quantities such as lab results and vital signs in a dictionary because the numbers can be anything. So you need some kind of component to do analysis, and the relations are largely missing. So one of the components that we have is something I call concept transformer, which is to take a term that you encounter in the text that you're processing, and can you, by using grammar rules, change it into something that is in the dictionary. So you use rules that you know preserve the meaning. We'll see a couple of these. To take something that, if we knew the dictionary entry, we'd be able to say, oh yes, that means the same thing. But the system has to be told explicitly how to do it. So the couple examples here, pain in the abdomen and abdominal pain. They mean the same thing. Or red tongue, tongue redness. Now there may be stylistic reasons why you use one rather than the other, but to all intents and purposes, they mean the same thing. And you can easily come up with the grammar rules that we use, subconsciously maybe, to do this translation. So at the bottom here we have a post-modifying noun could become a pre-modifying adjective. And there are others similar to it. So by doing some transforming on a phrase that looks like it should be in the dictionary that isn't, we can actually make it into something that's in the dictionary so we know what concept it is, so we know what GUI to associate with it, and we can then, downstream components can then do their thing. So a couple of more sophisticated, if you like, examples that come out of this. Distended jugular veins, by doing these transformations, we can match with venous jugular distension. Right. It looks so similar, but not quite the same. But they adhere to these rules of transformation. Also, if you're using the parse tree, the nice thing about the parse tree is that syntactic and sometimes semantic distance is represented in a more easy to use way than distance in a sentence. In this sentence here, the feet are stiff, even though that's the first and last word of the sentence. But from a logical point of view, and if you look at the parse tree, there's an equal distance between stiffness and hands, stiffness and feet, swelling in hands, swelling in feet. They all have the same distance, and they are amenable to these transformations. Might turn out that just extracting them from the parse tree is enough. Once you've done that, you can look them up in your UMLS-based dictionary, and there you are. So you've got the four concepts of stiff hands, stiff feet, swollen hands, and swollen feet, whereas a more limited component, if it's lucky, will just get swelling in the hands, because those are adjacent. That's all you get. By a value analysis, I have a table of standard reference ranges for the labs, the typical labs that doctors do. And in order to make use of that, I have to do language processing on numerical expressions and lab expressions. So I'm just going to work through a quick example here. Hyperkalemia was on an earlier slide. I said it meant your potassium is high. Well, how would you get that from the lab result? Potassium 30 milligrams per deciliter. So that's the text that you see. So you have a component that comes in that identifies concepts. Okay, so we got potassium. So we've got the quantity, happens to have a GUI. We'll identify the unit. Another annotator comes in, it knows how to recognize units. It recognizes milligrams per deciliter. And when I say recognize, it knows it well enough that it can find how it relates to some canonical form. The canonical base unit is grams per liter with a conversion factor of 0.1. That way, when you have some other measurement, you can do a conversion. Then over 30 is a numerical range. Technically, it could go up to infinity. Practically, we know that's not going to happen, but why not just say this is a range from 30 to infinity. Then you put the measurement range, the measurement, we get a measurement concept out of the measurement, out of the range and the unit, which is this thing, and then you put it all together. A lab value annotator that's looking for a quantity and is looking for a measurement. So you can see by a cascade of annotators, each of which does something fairly simple. By cascading them, you can do a more complex analysis. Now we've got a lab value, and we look it up in the table, and we see, oh, this corresponds to an entry, but it's high. It's above the range. So now we know it's high, and the CUI that corresponds to high potassium in the blood is that. And so we make exactly the same annotation in the text as if it had said hyperkalemia. So now a downstream component doesn't need to worry about the lab value. Say, oh, it's hyperkalemia that the patient has. So whichever way the doctor has written it, or it comes in the note, downstream components can do the same thing and don't need to worry about how it was written. But we have complete provenance because all of these intermediate annotations are left there so that we can trace how it came about, if ever that's the first. Relation chain. I mentioned that there are relations in UMLS, but you've got to put them together, usually, in order to get what you want. So let's say the task is to connect a medication that's been ordered for the patient with a problem that's in the problem list. I mentioned before, in your medical record is what's called a problem list. These are sort of all of the things that are either wrong with you or have been wrong with you that the doctor needs to look out for on an ongoing basis. Not things that you once had and are now resolved and are dispensed with. If you had a heart attack once, that has to stay on forever. So that's what the problem list is. We'll see an example of that in a minute. And you have a medication in your ordered medications, and you want to establish, is there a connection between the two? UMLS is very good. It has treats and prevents relations that will connect medications and diseases. But there's a problem. And the problem is represented by this picture. Anyone know where this picture was taken? Not around here. It's a very famous.
Is it in Malaysia?
It's in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. It's called the Petronas Towers, which is, I think, at the time, it's the tallest building in Asia or something. So very conveniently, this picture was taken without the ground floor, and this represents the situation we had. The left-hand tower might correspond to a disease hierarchy. You've got a narrow disease, which is an instance of a broader one, which is an instance of a broader one, and so on. And the other tower corresponds to the medication. There is only at one level there is an instance of a treatment connection in UMLS. It doesn't connect everything on the left with everything on the right. You've got to go up and down the elevators to cross over at the corresponding point. And you've got to do that also, I'm calling it through inference, in the system. And what we're doing by doing that is basically enforcing rules like this. If a drug treats a condition, then a medication that contains that drug also contains that, also treats that condition. So it's a fairly simple inference. It's not, again, rocket science, but you've got to take a step in order to do the treatment. So we establish some patterns like this. Any amounts of the inverse of the is-a relationship, followed by a treats or is treated by, and then contained in is a valid connection between two endpoints. So here's an example. Here's an example where you've got infection, and that class includes lower respiratory tract infection, which is treated by amoxicillin, which is an ingredient of that medication. In bold there is the relation that's in UMLS. That central portion of that relation. That's a relation in UMLS. But if infection is in your problem list, and the augmentin is in your meds, how do you make the connection unless you go up and down your elevators? So I'm going to skip, for lack of time. This is just an overview of the fact that this project is necessary. All right, we'll just skip through those. This is a diagrammatic representation of basically you've got a bunch of clinical notes, which is on the left of the diagram, and a database of structured information. There may be your labs, it may be all of your ordered medications and procedures and so on. And we have to use both of them in order to provide good clinical decision support. A typical EMR from some of our partners, the Cleveland Clinic, there were 300 notes. And a note is a page or so, typically. In the Veterans Administration, which had both older patients and sicker patients, or maybe they just went to the doctor more often, there were many more notes per patient. That's a huge amount of processing per patient that's necessary. So we have pipelines, we have general medical NLP, and note-based processing, which is to determine what the different sections are of the note type. Are there goals that the doctor has set for the patient, and so on. And some more processing that I'm not going to touch on now that crosses the whole EMR that goes between notes. So I've talked about these different processing components. So what can we do beyond what's in parts when we've got these? And we build an application that's very useful to support the doctor. So I'm going to talk about two briefly, and then I'll finish. Semantic Find, you can think of as being a search or find capability. Control F, you're probably all familiar with, I'm not quite sure what it is on an Apple. If you want to locate something in a document, it's on keystroke, then you can type in a string, and you'll locate it. So this Semantic Find takes this to the nth degree, because doctors are interested in concepts. But the problem is the concept may not be using the very words or letters that they type, because there are a lot of synonyms, there are a lot of ways the concept could be represented, or there could be related things to the concept that aren't the concept itself, but maybe a medication to treat a disease or symptom and so on. So the idea is that we employ in Semantic Find is to do a bunch of different searches. We're not going to presume what the doctor is looking for. We'll do a bunch of different searches and give back all of the results neatly separated and let them choose and look, see what they want. So it's not a question answering system. It's not a design of a new user interface, even though I'm going to show you one. It's just a research prototype. It's not a proposal. And it's not a clinical trial manager. So I've really talked about that. Okay, in the middle, we have a bunch of search types. These are ways in which your search term could match something in the document. So there's literal match, which is what Control F does. Semantic match, is that enhanced, if you like, by synonym matching, things that mean exactly the same thing. More specific, more general, that speaks for itself. And then they're negated and hypothetical, match things that are in the negative or the hypothetical context. Also, associated concepts. So associated medications, associated tests, associated diseases, you might want to know those two. And also what ordered meds or ordered procedures are in the medical record. Not all of these will generate matches for a given patient, for a given search term. That's sort of the maximal that you could get is these 13, I think it is, different kinds of matches. So this is an example of probably approximately one per search type. Down the left-hand column, search term. In the middle column are the kinds of text that search term can generate a match for using the type of match in the right-hand column. Now understand that all matches are tried for all search terms, and you'll see how that's organized in a second. But the thing to take away from this is that the middle column consists of terms that are very strongly related in some sense to the term in the left that you as a doctor may well be interested in seeing, but using a typical search you're not going to find. And I have some numbers on it. Okay, so a paper that we published earlier this year in EMEA. So an evaluation, we did 4 of the search types. We have our medical students evaluate the results that the system had generated from a bunch of search terms that an MD had come up with, and rated them as basically good or bad. Do you expect to see it, or is it an error? We had 92% F measure, which I think is pretty good. But there were some more interesting things. So I mentioned that we find more than all F would find. So let's try and quantify that. So with the search term, we made the assumption that if we put aside all of these associated concepts, because reasonable people can disagree as to whether an associated term is something that you would expect the system to come back with. So if you type in a medication, whether it should produce the disease or the symptoms, people could disagree. But there are much less disagreement about whether a term means the same as that, or is a more specific version of that, or is the same term in a negative context. That's what we evaluate. So we did a progressive analysis of true positives in our system, relative to literal match, which is what you get with Control F. So we did literal match, semantic match, and then more specific added on, and then contradicted added on to that. So this is what we found. So if you just count the number of true positive matches, and you could tell from the F measure that there's not too much noise going on. But by adding in semantic match, you get another 21%. If you add in more specific, you get a huge jump. And a few more when you're adding contradicted match. Now don't forget, contradicted match, you might well also match with Control F, but it won't be indicated as being the opposite. So basically, by this particular measure, there's a lot of dark matter that you don't get with a regular Control F type search. So I'm running out of time. I have a few slides on the dashboard and the user interface for Semantic Find, which I can get to if questions come up, but I think I'll pause it there and turn it over to the audience for questions.
Thank you. We do have a few minutes for questions before we hit 1 o'clock. So.
When you talked about using the prefixes, the hypo, hyper, and so on, have you done anything with graded adjectives too? Slight, moderate, strong?
Oh, no, that's a morass.
Well, yes, well, it is.
Right, because, yeah, different people are going to disagree or agree on whether it corresponds to a match, if it's only slightly or moderately. That's very important, I think, to do something with. Exactly what, and exactly how to evaluate it is, I think, a challenge. I think the easiest thing to do is just to distinguish between those that are positive versus those that are negative. That's sort of the easiest, the low-hanging fruit. Beyond that, no.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about the data that's underlying all this, the Kapora that you're parsing, and how much computational resources is needed to do this sort of matching and work.
Okay.
Kind of two questions.
So it takes us, what we have in our applications is a front end that acts against the back end. The back end contains medical data pre-processed. So all of the clinical notes have been processed by our analytics. It can't, not everything you do, you want your application to do, can be done in the back end, because in the case of Semantic Find, maybe I'll just, that was a very interesting. These are some screenshots of Semantic Find where the search term is HTN, and you see two panels indicating different aspects of the results. On the right, at the top, is the note that has been selected from the hit list on the left. That's been pre-processed, and for in our current situation, we have maybe 200,000, about 100,000 notes, which are in 500 EMRs, 500 records. That might take about a day to process. But you can only go so far, because what that will do is that will establish all of the concepts that are in the nodes and some relationships between them. But when the user types in a search term, in this case HTN has been typed in, short for hypertension. We want to match everything that HTN matches with along these different dimensions. So you've got to do the NLP. It might be a longer phrase than just 3 letters. You've got to do the NLP on the input. And you've got to do the relation chaining or some part of that, plus the matching live at runtime. So we try to do as much as possible in terms of pre-processing the corpus, but we can't do everything. We've got it down to the point where it's fairly interactive. You can get a response within a second or two. Mostly. Yeah.
This is a broader question, not necessarily about the method. In recent years, we keep hearing AI is going to replace humans, right?
Yes.
That's the hyperbole around it. In the ideal world, what would you see as a partnership between AI and physicians? Like, what AI would contribute, and like let's say in 10 years, and then how physician can benefit from AI?
I think you're seeing it. That is AI.
That's right.
Yes, this is one example.
Right.
So I could just
This is
lead
the
to
current
this
state.
example in order to answer your question a little bit. The scenarios at the top, right? Blood pressure control is important in the management of diabetes. You've got a diabetic patient, but that's not the only thing you're interested in. You're not just interested in your A1C levels, which is measurement of the sugars in the blood that are indicative of how you're doing and how well it's controlled. There are other things too that are important, right? So what we're showing here is HTN has been typed in, so that's what you're interested in. But we don't pretend to know everything that the doctor might want to do with these results. So we compartmentalize the result with the literal match, semantic match, and so on. What we've done is the heavy lifting of looking in hundreds and hundreds of clinical notes to find those that have matches along various dimensions to what the user's typing in, to save them having to look and presumably miss, not because they're stupid, just because of the volumes of the material. But say maybe something from 6 months ago, so just by flipping through your chart, even if you've got a paper chart, you won't see it because it's a long time ago. So the computer's ability not to forget, to be able to look just as easily in something that happened a long time ago and something that happened yesterday, that's very important too. So we're not proposing any diagnoses, but particularly
I can probably help you with this as a clinician
yes.
who has looked at these things and is actually driven into this field because of frustration and dissatisfaction with the direction. And I must say that the thing that really impresses me about just the general format of how you thinking that's gone into this is my criticism has always been that the fundamental question before you start putting a system together like this is, do we have enough information that tells us how a clinician thinks, which is different. And that answers your question, because from my standpoint, I see this running next to me, which is something that I can reach out and grab. That's one thing. And I think some of the factors that really, I'm very impressed. Some of the factors that I see are the idea of contradictions, contradictory things are very, very important, and the idea of negatives. And being able to convert those types of concepts into the framework truly brings it closer to, to what something that you want. It's like a companion. This is not. I don't see it replacing. I already think that this is artificial intelligence, and I would see this as a supportive companion.
Yes, thank you very much. That's very well stated, and absolutely, it actually corresponds to the way we look at it. It's not to replace, but to enhance doctors' ability to do their thing.
And it doesn't produce frustration, because it's not only looking at things that have to be, because the answer that I hear in all the classes with people who are coming up is why isn't it all converted to construction data? Or why is it not, why don't they think this way? Why are they technophobic? Well, I had an electron laser in my, in my operating room 20 years ago. And I'm not a technophobe, but as a matter of fact, that if the technology works for me, then it's a good technology. If it doesn't, then it's not.
Exactly.
One last question.
So I must say that it's very refreshing to come to an NLP talk that doesn't mention deep learning as sort of saving the world and word embeddings. And so my question is, why didn't you mention deep learning and word embeddings?
Data. I'm not going to say anything bad about deep learning. It's the fact that you need tons and tons of labeled data is very difficult to come by in the medical world. It's difficult enough just to get data, to have an arrangement with a provider where they let you see the medical records. But in order to get labeled data, who's going to do the labeling? You can't crowdsource it because of PHI reasons, personal health information. You can't just send it out there. The information is very heavily controlled. And attending physicians and some of our consultants have said, medical students aren't really good enough to do everything that you want to do. For some of the things, yes, but where you want judgments, you really want you want someone who's more sophisticated, more experienced. They're very expensive, and you're not going to get, except for a short time for a very well-focused study. We have been able, luckily, to do a small amount of that. You're not going to get that. So I think that's the real reason. I think if we can do better feature generation through these knowledge-based techniques, then we could bring the input to a deep learning system to a much more knowledgeable level that it wouldn't need nearly so much data, because it's relearning. A lot of these deep learning systems are learning the same thing over and over again. Okay, embeddings have some kind of knowledge of English that's sort of common, but still, they're learning the same thing over and over again, which is why you need so much data. Why can't we just tell it that stuff? And then have it do some smart stuff on top of that? I think that's the reason why.
I think the term deep learning is kind of unfortunate, because I would, labeling aside, I would look at this as much deeper learning, really. I mean, this is developing an understanding of how, by taking things apart, of how you know, in your mind, how you put things together in order to arrive at your diagnosis.
Sure. The IBM communications department, PR department loved it.
All right.
No, I think you're right.
Thanks for the good questions, and thanks for